Happy Friday, everyone. Welcome back to Drumversations. It's been another crazy week, and I've had some really interesting conversations and thoughts I want to share today, continuing the thought and idea and the conversation around practicing the politics of humanity. But as always, first we just want to breathe. So breathe in, breathe out, breathe in, breathe out. As we breathe in, we're breathing all the blessings the universe has for us in. Breathe out all the anxiety. In all the good vibrations. And out all the crazy. Breathe in, center. Out crazy. There's so much crazy. We had to do that twice. The volume's low. Okay, fix it. Like, go to the, and turn the Vox up. As always, ancestral veneration. We'll put the ancestors in the chat, and I'll play the ancestral drum call. Ashe. Ed Bell, Ashe. Edna Bell, Ashe. Charles Bell, Ashe. William Bell, Ashe. George Bell, Ashe. Mike Bell, Ashe. Danielle Bell, Ashe. Patricia Bell, Ashe. Larry Baker Jr., Ashe. Frank Hubbard Sr., Ashe. Ella Hubbard, Ashe. Everly Hubbard, Ashe. And based on the news this week, there are so many other names, but in particular, the name of Breonna Taylor we lift up, Ashe. You know, the injustice surrounding, speaking of Breonna Taylor, her murder, reminds us that there can be no healing without justice, right? It's great that her family got the $12 million settlement in the civil suit, but like Stevie Wonder said this week, there's never been an amount of money that can bring a person back, right? And so we appreciate that result, the $12 million, in as much as it can help the family, but that's not justice, right? And I don't know, I've been following Stevie Wonder since I was a little kid, and this is the first time I ever heard him cuss. If you haven't seen his video, it's really interesting. It's just one word, but 2020 has made Stevie Wonder cuss. That just lets you know what kind of year this is, right? But it's also interesting that there's no justice for Breonna's family, and that injustice happened 45 years to the day that the murderers of Emmett Till were acquitted, right? So this racism, this issue in America has a feedback loop that's absolutely negative. And the continual trauma, spiritually, emotionally, physically, psychologically, it's a lot. It's a lot to carry. It's a lot to bear. And so today we want to talk about, you know, how maybe we can put these ideas into practice, right? And the theme for the day is radical ritualism and the value of good trouble. And I want to look at three quotes, two by Malidoma Some, who we talked about last week, of the Dagar people who were sent by his people to his enemies, you know, people who weren't friends of the people, to educate folks on, you know, their cultural practices and, you know, a different worldview and a different approach to spirit and to society and to each other that hopefully will help bring the world to its right mind. And also, I wanted to unpack a little bit this quote that people have been really pushing since the transition of John Lewis around good trouble. And it often gets truncated where people using the word will say, or using the quote or invoking the quote, will say, hey, you know, let's go get in good trouble as it relates to equity issues. But that's not really what the quote is about. So I want to dig into that and then deal with these rituals to get us into good trouble. Yeah.
We have more ancestors. William Daniel Cox.
William Daniel Cox, Ashe.
Edward William Cox Jr.
Edward William Cox Jr., Ashe. So we're going to unpack two quotes from Malidoma Some and one from John Lewis. The two from Malidoma are about ritual. The one from John Lewis is good trouble. And then I'll outline three rituals. These are things that we can do daily to guide, you know, our work and our progress toward outcomes. So it's all, again, part of this idea of cultivation and practice of a politics of humanity, right? We've been talking about that for the last month. And remember, the three macro ideas are the need for a total shift in the culture. And the reason why I keep harping on culture shift is because even in the wake of these rulings that are saying that these police murders are legal, right? Everybody wants a shift or a change in the law to make these incidences illegal, right? And I'm not against the shift in the policy, in the law itself. But what we learned, I think, or what we need to take away from the new laws and the shift in policy that came out of the civil rights movement in the middle of the 20th century is that you cannot legislate culture, right? So if you think about Brown v. Board of Education, it says, hey, separate and equal, they kept everything separate but unequal, right? The law says separate but equal schools, but the practice was separate and unequal because the practice derives from culture, right? Even when it comes to integration, integration says that you can be together, but that doesn't mean you can be together, right? So we can afford to live in the same neighborhoods because neighborhoods are now integrated, right? But that doesn't mean that an African-American family is paying the same for their house as a European-American family, even if they have all the same stuff, credit scores, income, all that kind of stuff. Because of redlining 2.0, the valuation of the house has changed based on the ethnicity of the occupant. And as a result of that, what that family is paying. There was a recent article on NPR a couple of weeks ago where a biracial, mixed race couple rather, were selling the house. And when they were first showing the house, pictures of the African-American wife were readily visible to the visitors. And they were getting offers that were below the asking price. When they removed all evidence of the wife and either only had pictures of the husband, a white male there, or no pictures at all, they got more than the asking price, right? And that's all about perception, and perception is defined by culture. So even though technically redlining is illegal, the way it operates in practice derives from culture, which again is steeped in these racist ideals and values that the country is built on, right? So we have to have a culture shift, because even if and when we get just, quote unquote, just laws on the books, those laws are either often not enforced or does not kind of define the cultural practice, because you cannot legislate culture. So that's the first big thing. We need to shift the culture completely from exploitation, one rooted in, racist ideas and ideals, to one that's equitable, culture that's equitable, human-centered, right? Then in order to perpetuate that human-centered culture, we have to reimagine education to socialize future generations toward their collective humanity, right? Perpetuating that ideal culture. And then once we've done those two things, I would hope that our focus is less on generating individual wealth at the expense of our fellow human beings, our neighbors, from that to now adding value. So what can I do to make the world a better place? And in doing that work, we are taking care of each other, which means we are all taken care of, right? Completely different shift and way of existing in the world that's more aligned with what Some and others who teach in that Afrocentric capacity espouse, rather than what we have come to know in the West. But the obvious question is, once we understand these macro concepts, culture shift, reimagining education, and focusing on adding value, what are the micro steps that bring this about, right? So that's why I think it's important to begin to think about, the importance of ritual and the value of good trouble, right? Because if you are creating or working to create this kind of transformation, you're going against the status quo, which means the static is going to happen. You're going to get in trouble because you're trying to change stuff and people are comfortable with the way things are, right? That's where the idea of good trouble comes in. So we talked about Malidoma Some a little bit last week, and we're referencing his book Of Water and the Spirit. This is a book my father recommended to me a while ago. It's called Of Water and the Spirit, Ritual, Magic, and the Initiation in the Life of an African Shaman. And just to refresh, at 4 years old, he's of the Dagar, the Dagar people in Burkina Faso, primarily in Burkina Faso. At 4 years old, he was kidnapped by French Jesuit priests. He was raised and educated in the French educational tradition. He escaped and returned to his village at 20 and did not fit in. He was no longer of his people in so many ways. And in order to fix that, the elders put him through a rites of passage and initiated him back into their culture. And he says that that process brought him back into his right frame of mind. It alleviated him of the anxieties and other issues of fear and mental health that he was experiencing. And it reconnected him spiritually to his ancestors, to his land, and to his people, right? And he's now been able to go and teach all of these wonderful things that he has learned to help other people return to their sense of self and center, right? So the first quote, it comes to change, and the second was really focused on ritual, because we have to understand why we are doing these things, right? So Some says, it is important that the change we want to see be the change that we have intentionally crafted. That is why the Dagar say, when you don't steer your own change, change will happen upon you. More often than not, even when we have delineated the nature of the change that we want to see happen, some other change happens as a direct response to the clarity of our minds. And this is because the other world, the ancestral realm, knows better what change is suitable to us, but wants our participation in it to come in the form of us being able to draft something so that it, the spiritual realm, the ancestors, can supply that something else, right? This something else is the mechanism or is close to the mechanism of ritual, which is like a journey unto itself. And as we learn the journey, as we begin the journey in the form of planning, we are the author of our own making until we start the ritual itself, at which point a new chauffeur, the ancestors, show up to give us a ride, right? And we're better off when we let everything go after we've initiated that process. Yeah. Spiritual reconnection. That's what this is all about, right? We can only be in the way we are, the context we are right now, as a result, not just of cognitive dissonance, that's mind, not just of disconnection physically to the planet and to each other, but spiritually being disconnected, right? And what Maladoma is saying here is that we have to be very intentional about the change that we want to see, and then begin the process of bringing that change about, at which point the ancestors then are given the green light, as it were, to do the work of not just guiding us, but bending, in King's words, the arc of the universe toward justice, right? We cannot do that by ourselves. This work is generational, moving forward, and ancestral in the spiritual sense of calling back, Sankofa, understanding, learning from, being guided by in this present moment to create the future, right? And it's much like my compositional process or any creative process, as an example, right? When I sit down to compose, often I have an idea of what I want to compose, right? But as I get into that process and begin to put the notes on the page, oftentimes something takes over. It's the ancestors. They take me in directions I had not thought about, and many times could not have thought about until I got into the practice or the posture of composition, right? And it's at that point that I have to decide to follow that guidance or fight against that guidance. And when I fight against that guidance, it gets exponentially harder, right? When I follow the path that the ancestors have for me, that composition starts to flow and I write more quickly, and it ends up being a better piece than I could have ever imagined. What would happen if we return to this sense of flow and being guided or driven, in Soma's words, by the ancestors, right? What if we could see that in real time play out? By planning our work and beginning to work our plan, we don't know what will happen, right? But we have to trust that in just taking the first step, the second step will be laid out to us, right? Again, King said, you know where California is, but you can't see it if you're in New York. And if you're driving at night, your headlights only show 200 feet ahead of you, but if you're pointed in the right direction, you turn your lights on and you can see 200 feet, then the next 200 feet, then the next 200 feet. And before you know it, just by going 200 feet at a time, you've driven the thousands of miles that it takes to cross the country and arrive in California. That's this work, right? That's this work. And John Lewis's quote will echo that. But the idea is to be intentional about the change. That's vision, right? That's what a politics of humanity really does. The politics part is the negotiation of power, right? And Wade Noble says that power is the ability to define reality. But how do you define something that you cannot see? You can't. So you have to first envision, collectively, we have to first envision what country, what world we want to live in, right? And then we do the work of planning that world, planning for that world. And then we do that, begin the work of bringing those plans about, right? Manifesting that world, right? And somebody says, once we begin that process, the ancestors take over and begin to guide us and not necessarily make the work easier just because, right? But they begin to affirm that work. And this is true of the 400. When I started, I was going to get it done no matter what. The more I got into it, the more the ancestors guided and the more resources came to bear. Literally, resources just appeared. I didn't ask, I didn't write a grant, but of the $120,000 that we spent on that project, about 35 of it manifested because of the work, right? I believe the same is true in this process. The second quote, and then I'll play something. He says, the more we involve ourselves with radical sacred events, the more we ask ourselves to become the kind of givers that are less interested in credit taking in the immediate. Because in the context in which we live, it is important that those of us who are awake envisage their giving to the world in a way that they expect a return for it. And this is very difficult because we live in a world in which if you have done something, you need credit, as if somehow that giving is a transaction that is fair. The point of it is that the little thing that we do, wherever we do it, however anonymously, to the degree that it contributes to some form of healing, sometimes so far away that it's hard to connect the giving to the change, right? It is important that we understand the notion of reward has to be something that we set aside for now. Because it is this kind of thing, that transactional behavior, that gets in the way or delays the delivery of our capacity to heal ourselves and to heal others. That's really interesting to me, right? If we see the future that we want, if we begin the process of planning for that future, and we begin the process of bringing that future, manifesting that future, right? Bringing it into reality. And we do that based on what Malidoma is saying, and we do that with the expectation of a return, then we get in our own way. We get in our own way. I experienced this personally, trying to, do things here and there, music-wise or whatever, and expecting some personal return, right? And I found recently that I've gotten in my own way because I get hung up on the lack of the return in the way I imagined it. But I need to be focused more on my purpose, my role, and let the ancestors take care of the rest, right? This is generational work. It's long-term work, right? If I am worried about a return here and now in the present, then I lose sight of the fact that this work is for my grandchildren's grandchildren's grandchildren, right? Well, I'll unpack that more after I play some music. All right. Let's see. So if we give with the expectation of a return in the near term, right? In the near future, then we can get in the way of the healing and the transformation. So we have to envision the future. We have to be intentional about the future that we want to see, right? We have to plan the work of manifesting that future. Then we have to do the work of bringing that future about without any expectation that we will actually see that future. And that's not really hard to understand, except for the fact that culturally we live in a capitalistic society, and if you pay something, you expect something in return, as Malidoma says, right? But you have to think about just in recent history. We don't even have to go way back. So the folks who created America, I'm sure, had an understanding that what they were putting in place, the infrastructure that they were laying, would not be realized fully by them, right? That's why they created the documents they did in the way they did. The Constitution is a document that has been and can be changed. It is a living document. It is not something that was set in place in the 18th century, and it remains exactly that way, which is why, again, my favorite slave owner, Thomas Jefferson, said that if government is not, I'm paraphrasing, if government's not working for you, it is incumbent upon the people to change the government, right? This is not anti-American. It is not, anti-anything. It is pro-democracy, a democracy that we've not yet ever had, right? It is pro-America, an America we've never had, right? And it's pro-global unity because we are all humans, and it's focused on centering humanity, right? What happens when the government works for the people? There will be liberty. When the people are afraid of the government, there will be tyranny. Again, Thomas Jefferson, right? So you don't even have to go back. But if we went back, we would see, as many of the folks who have researched traditional African culture have shown us empirically, that there were civilizations that worked for the people. And as a result of that, they did not have poverty in the way that we understand it. There were whole civilizations that never had prisons because the people were taken care of in a way that put the onus on them to add value as opposed to extract, right? So this stuff is not impossible, right? It's just we have to shift the way we think, right? So again, in these two quotes, Soma is advising us to plan our work our plan, and as we work our plan, the ancestors will meet us and help us complete this work. And then as we become ancestors, we become that next level of spiritual help for that next generation, and so on and so forth, right? And then we need to do that work without the expectation of return, personal return, so we can continue the work of transformation and not be in the way of our own healing and transformation, right? Now, John Lewis said, "Do not get lost in a sea of despair. Be hopeful, be optimistic. Our struggle is not the struggle of a day, a week, a month, or a year. It is the struggle of a lifetime. Never be afraid to make some noise and get in good trouble." I think it's interesting that all the folks that I've heard reference this quote only talk about the good trouble part. Is it such the case that in the America of today, we cannot see ourselves doing work that has no immediate return? Are we, really that shallow? Again, Toni Morrison has said when she was growing up, the national conversation was about being a good neighbor. That was in the 40s. And then by the 60s, it was be a good citizen, right? By the 80s, it was taxpayers, right? And then it shifted at some point in the Clinton era from taxpayer to consumer, from taxpayer to consumer, and then it shifted from consumer to shareholder. At each point, it goes, the idea of who we are moves away from each other and investing in each other as we would if we were neighbors and citizens, right? To extracting resources, right? If I'm a taxpayer, I don't have to worry about you as an individual. I just need to pay my taxes and chill. But if I'm a consumer, I don't even need to pay my taxes, as some people who are leading government, may or may not have, right? If I'm a consumer, I'm literally about extracting resources. I'm getting things. I'm consuming things. And that's how I'm defining my value, by the things that I'm able to own, right? And if I'm a shareholder, those things aren't even relevant anymore because I want to own the thing that makes the thing. And I'm extracting resources to the detriment of folks who cannot afford those things, right? But I'd rather this company use its resources to pay me my return because I own a portion of the company than do right by its own employees and vis-a-vis paying fair wages, living wages, sustainable wages, right? Health insurance and the like. Those are all extractions, not value adds, right? But I think the core of what John Lewis is saying is really three things in this quote. He says, don't get lost in the sea of despair. That sentence alone is powerful. Because what I hear as I do this work, even via Zoom around the country, is that people, no matter how they look, if they care or what their bank accounts say or what their educational level, if they care about people feel overwhelmed who are in the space. They're woke, quote unquote, or they're caring. They want to make a difference. They're feeling overwhelmed. They feel as though they themselves can't do anything to change the situation for the better. Right? And John Lewis says, do not get lost in the sea of despair, right? Be hopeful, be optimistic. So don't focus on sweeping back the ocean, right? That is overwhelming. The ocean is always going to win, right? Instead of focusing on what we can't do and getting into that negative feedback loop or that lower vibration, focus on what you can do. Be hopeful. Be optimistic. Sometimes if you're a teacher or you work with kids, you're a mentor, it's that kid that's right in front of you. If you work at Big Brothers Big Sister and you have one little brother or little sister, that is your work in that moment. And you chose that work, right? And you don't know how helping that young person is going to change that trajectory of that person and how that person then impacts others, right? Education. It's the most important thing we can do. And it's informal and it's formal, right? So if you're supporting in the schools like City Year, if you are supporting after school, if you are supporting in your neighborhood, in your family, your own children, in your home, right? Support is not just putting food on the table and making sure they have a safe place to live. Those are basic necessities, right? It's the time, it's the investment, it's the energy, and it's the covering with positive words, and it's the investment of yourself, spiritual energy, into that young person, that other human being that lets them know they matter, right? That's value add. That's not an extraction. You're doing it because that person deserves to be loved. That person deserves to be cared for. And that person is valuable just because they exist, right? Focus on the things that we can do. Gratitude. We can be grateful every day. Life can suck. Politically, it sucks right now. Culturally, it sucks right now. But I am still grateful that I'm breathing. I'm able to breathe with you every week, that my wife and my children are healthy, relatively happy, and relatively whole, right? We all have our work to do, but we're a functioning quartet, and we're doing the best we can every day. And for that, I am grateful. And because I see my children growing and becoming, I have hope for the future. Right? I can be optimistic. What are the things in your life that brings you hope, that makes you optimistic, so that we don't have to get lost in the sea of despair? Sometimes it's more important to be hopeful and optimistic than it is to get in good trouble, because you can't get in good trouble until you are in a place where you can do the work. And that's where hope and optimism comes, because it brings a different energy, a different vibrancy to who you are. And it helps you see differently the impact you can have in the world, right? So the first important thing about this quote is not to let the bad stuff overwhelm you. The second thing is that you need to focus on the things that give you hope and bring about optimism for you and your perception in life. The third thing he says is that our struggle is not the struggle of a day, a week, a month, or a year. It's the struggle of a lifetime. Now we're back to that return, right? If we're doing the work expecting a return in the near future, then we get in the way of the healing. We get in the way of the transformation, right? This is not just a lifetime of work. It took more than 400 years for us to get here in the American context, or what became the American context. It likely will take as many or more generations to fix this thing. So our lifetime, from the day that we begin this work, begins to have purpose and intention to bring about transformation, right? But then we pass that on to the next generation, so they continue that work. And when we transition to ancestors, we guide them. It's not a day. It's not a week. It's not a month. It's not a year, right? We have to be intentional about the future that we see, and we have to commit to doing the work of bringing about that future, right? And then he says, don't be afraid. Go make some noise and get into good trouble. If we focus on despair, if we get lost in that sea, right, it's hard to see how our voices matter, how our lives collectively matter, because we're overwhelmed and full of despair. But when we shift that vibration to hope, to optimism, that brings about a sense of power and agency internally that we all have. And then it's easier to not be afraid and go get into some good trouble. Audre Lorde says, when I use my voice in the service of my vision, and it doesn't matter if I'm afraid, right? That means she's committed more to doing the work than to wallowing in despair. It's really easy to do that. Just turn on the news, open up your phone. There's a lot going on that can make us feel bad, right? But when we focus on the things we're grateful for, that give us hope, that bring optimism, then it's easier to make some noise and get into good trouble. So the question becomes, what are those things that we can do right now, right? Right now, individually and collectively, that help us get into good trouble in a way that brings about transformation? And there are three things. There are more, but these, again, three things. We only have so much time. The first, and these are all ritualistic, and I use the word ritual both spiritually and as a discipline, right? For me, music is both ritual and discipline. It's something that I do regularly, daily, and it's something that brings about transformation, as rituals do. The first is the ritual of connection, right? That's why we breathe at the beginning of Drumversation. We are breathing to create synchronicity across distances through the internet, right? So we're synchronizing with each other. We're connecting with each other by breathing, right? So first, connecting to yourself, connecting to each other, connecting to your ancestors, connecting to any and everything that brings life, hope, optimism. That's the first thing we have to do, is reconnect, right? That's spiritual, it's cultural, it's communal. The second thing we have to practice is the ritual of preparation, right? When you do the work of preparing, then once you engage, you know what's going on, right? What I hear often is, I don't have the language, or I don't have a sense of purpose and where I fit in. I don't. And what I often say to folks after a certain amount of time is, you're just telling me what you don't or can't do. What can you do? Oh, well, I can sing, or, I'm a good writer, or I'm good at, editing, digital content, or what have you. So how then can you use that stuff, those things that you can do, to add value to the world, right? It's not about what you can't do. And a lot of times we're focusing on what we can't do because we see so many other people doing things that we think are great, and that's great, that's fine. But many hands make light work, right? There are 3 people right here now, and I'm just right here talking to you, and I got 2 other folks trying to figure out what's wrong with the signal. I can't do this by myself, right? There's nothing that we can do by ourselves that we can't do better together, right? So as you prepare yourself, that's education. Read some books, figure out who you are, read about this history that we've been talking about. There are resources on my website, marklomaxii.com. If you scroll down, there are resources there that get you started, right? Podcasts, Seen on Radio, and books by Maladoma Patrice Somé and Dr. Joy DeGroy, and so many people that we've mentioned here, all help you start figuring out how these issues, what they are and how they connect, right? And it also gives you language. Barbara Fields and Karen Fields, Dr. Barbara and Dr. Karen Fields, wrote a book called Racecraft. The whole thing deals with language, right? So if you are a person who wants to engage and you don't understand the language that might help you engage, right? One is the language of humanity. So that's one thing. The other thing, this resource, Racecraft, is a great book to help you understand the language, right? So connection, the ritual of connection, that is a ritual, right? How often do you meditate and connect with yourself? How often are you intentional about connecting with others? Those are rituals, right? It's a spiritual connection we have with each other. That's a ritual. The ritual of preparation, right? The dedication of time to an hour a day if you can. If not, 20 minutes, 10 minutes. And there was a time where I was so busy that I only could read a book when I was in the bathroom taking care of other business, right? You find the time if you're intentional about wanting to be prepared, right? You'll make that time. And it becomes a discipline. That's why I call it a ritual. And then finally, the ritual of action, right? Once you have developed the ritual of connecting to yourself, to your ancestors, however you define spirit traditions, and to your community or communities even, right? Other human beings. Once you've developed a ritual of preparation, right? You start to get all this information, it's in you. You start to shift or develop new perspectives. You understand things a little differently because of that preparation. Then you're ready to act. Now, the issue is all of these things you've done up until now are actions, right? We have a society where we feel like in order to make a difference, we have to do that big thing, right? We have to be recognized, and that's those immediate returns. No, those actions, when you walk down the street, if you're walking down the street and, people can see your eyes smiling over your mask, right? That's engaging folks and making somebody's day better, right? That can be a transformative action, right? Connecting with yourself is transforming you. Connecting with others creates community. Connecting with your spirit traditions helps you access that hope, that optimism, and that power that guides your preparation and then allows you to act with purpose and intention, right? There's never been a book, except for when I was in college, that I read because somebody told me I had to read it. People have come up to me and said, you're thinking about this? This is what, in school, they say, you have to read this book for this class. That's not always relevant. But when you're in conversation with people and you're sharing what you're thinking about, and I shared with my dad, I'm thinking about this. And he says, you know what? Maybe you should read this book of Water and Spirit. Recommendation. I would never have known about that book had I not been connecting with someone outside of myself, right? And it's not that academic, get a grade, go read the book. No, it's here's where you are. I'm sharing a resource so that you can further your journey. That's what community does, right? That's why it's important. And you read the book and you become more prepared so that when you act, you have the tools and the resources and the community to then go do something together. It's activating trust, right? Which we talked about a while ago. So the ritual of connection is the daily practice of centering ourselves spiritually, culturally, and even politically to ensure we stay on the path, right, and act with intention. The ritual of preparedness is the daily practice of centering the why of the work and keeping our purpose at the forefront. So every strategy, tactic, and outcome is focused on the liberation of humanity in general, and for our case, Africans in America specifically, right? Very important. The ritual of action is the daily practice of doing the work, right? James Brown said, a lot of folk be talking loud and ain't saying nothing. And what's worse, a lot of people are talking loud and not doing nothing, right? So what does it cost to be nice to the janitor, to the person who is tabulating your order at the grocery store, to the people who are stocking the shelves, right? That general kindness as a practice is transformative to people who feel unseen. That's just a human interaction that costs you nothing but gives everything. And at a greater level, preparing to engage, civically in the political and cultural shifts that need to happen means that you have to be armed with information, right? Not just raw data points, 35 African Americans per million are killed by police a year as opposed to 12 or 15 white Americans. That's a great data point. But if I don't know the context that makes that data point relevant, then it's useless, right? So preparing is not just about storing up facts that you can fire off of folks like they're arrows. It's about having context for that information. Text without context is pretext, right? And that's why a lot of the social movement in the contemporary times has not had the intended effect that I think a lot of folks would expect given the activity, right? Because the action has to be focused and grounded in enough information to be effective when the conversation comes. What do you want? Why do you want it? And how do we get there, right? So we can answer those questions by connecting, by preparing, and by doing the work every day to bring about these changes. And just in closing, I'm gonna play one last thing to go out, but I tweeted this week that a practice of humanity is how we transform pain into power, right? It hurts. It's just weekly, daily trauma, especially for Black America. That pain often results in righteous indignation, as Kwame Ture said, righteous rebellion. We're in the streets, we're protesting, we're marching for our rights. And not just our rights to participate in whatever America is, but our rights to be treated humanely because we're human, right? And that's absolutely important. But I've said it before and I'll say it again, that protests and even riots are tactics, not strategies. And what I've learned in a review, because I wasn't there, of the 20th century civil rights movement is that the protests and the march came after negotiations broke down in order to put public pressure on a private process, right? The process of shifting culture, of even changing laws, is something that's not sexy. It's not going to be on TV. Or it's on C-SPAN, but who watches C-SPAN? Except those of us who are nerds, right? And so we have to understand that that emotional release that we get from being out in the streets because we're angry is important, maybe for our mental and emotional and even spiritual health. But bringing about the change that ensures we don't have to be out there in the streets anymore is a different kind of work. It is a daily work. And I'm proud of the folks who are out there in the streets. I support them. And it's my job to make sure that I'm doing my job, my work, right? To bring about any change that I can so that they don't have to be in the streets anymore. For some folks, young folks, that makes perfect sense. For those of us who have a little more gray, our job is to guide them, to advise them when they ask, so that they can be as safe for themselves as possible and as effective as possible, and then use whatever leverage we have as elders in the community to help bring about change, right? That's how you move from pain to power. Maya Angelou says that pain can turn to bitterness if we don't shift that energy into action. And the things that we can do right now is begin the ritual of connection, the ritual of preparation, and the ritual of action. Those are things that we can do right now to begin to bring about change. So I hope you all have a good weekend. I'll post some more links on the website. So go check it out, marklomaxii.com. There's all kind of resources there. But again, our job is to help you, help your community, and we're served in that way by serving each other. No return required, right? We don't want to get in the way of our healing and our collective transformation. Peace.